What if the greatest turning point in human history began not with a war, but with a sky that suddenly went dark? Imagine living in a world where the sun faded, harvests failed, entire civilizations struggled to survive, and history itself was forever changed. What really caused this mysterious age of darkness, and how did humanity endure when the world seemed to be ending? Stay with us as we uncover one of the most chilling, forgotten chapters of our past. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another journey into history's greatest mysteries. The sun does not vanish all at once. It fades like a lamp seen through dirty glass until noon carries the colour of late evening, and the world begins to behave as if some hidden hand has loosened its grip on the seasons. Across fields that should be warming frost lingers. Across villages that wait for the ordinary return of green shoots, the soil remains stubborn and cold. In places where people measure time not by numbers on a page, but by the swelling of buds, the arrival of insects, the movement of animals, and the feel of light on the skin, something is wrong in a way that is difficult to name. The sky is still there, the sun is still there, but the sun is pale, weakened, almost ashamed of itself. It gives light without strength. Somewhere perhaps on an island of fire, perhaps in a volcanic chain far from the cities that will suffer most, a mountain has torn itself open. The first people near it may have known the disaster as thunder choking ash, collapsing roofs, and a landscape buried beneath grey weight. But beyond the edge of the eruption, beyond the lands where stones fall from the sky and forests are flattened, the catastrophe travels silently. It climbs into the high air. It becomes dust, sulphur haze, a veil, thin enough to be invisible in a single handful, yet vast enough to wrap around the planet. The ancient world does not understand it this way. No farmer in a cold field can know that particles suspended above the clouds may be turning sunlight back into space. No priest, merchant, soldier, or child can see the machinery of climate shifting overhead. They see only the result. Day after day, the light remains strange. This is the beginning of the lost era after the sky turned dark, a period that sits uneasily between catastrophe and transformation. It is not the end of humanity, not the fall of every kingdom, not a single clean break where one world disappears and another begins. History rarely offers such neat drama. What survives in the record suggests something more disturbing, a chain of stresses, each one sharpening the next as climate, hunger, disease, war, and political fragility move through societies already carrying their own weaknesses. The darkness does not create every crisis. It does not explain every collapse. Scholars still debate how much weight it deserves, yet again and again in tree rings, ice cores chronicles, and the uneven ruins of late antiquity, there is a sense of pressure gathering beneath the surface. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because this story is not only about a darkened sky, it is about the fragile systems people build beneath a sky they assume will behave. Imagine a settlement at the edge of a cultivated plain. It may stand in Europe, the Eastern Mediterranean, the Near East, Central Asia, or somewhere beyond the reach of surviving written records. Its people do not think of themselves as living in a world system, but they do. Their grain may depend on weather patterns that stretch beyond their valley. Their taxes may feed armies stationed hundreds of miles away. Their markets may receive goods carried along roads, rivers, caravan tracks, and sea lanes. Their rulers may claim divine favour, military strength, ancient legitimacy, or simple force. Their world has rhythms, and those rhythms are old enough to feel permanent. Winter comes, then softens. Seeds go into the ground. Animals fatten. Ships depart when winds allow. Taxes arrive when harvests permit. Temples, churches, shrines, and courts interpret the visible world as part of a moral or cosmic order. Then the order falters. The first year may be explained away. A bad season is not unknown. Late frost is not impossible. A weak harvest has happened before. People have words for scarcity, and older people have stories of hunger. Grain stores are opened more carefully. Livestock are counted with greater attention. Local officials, landowners, monasteries, or palace agents may begin to calculate what can be spared and what must be kept. Families stretch food. Meals become thinner. In the countryside, hope remains tied to the next planting. The earth has disappointed them once, but the earth is still the earth. But when the cold does not pass as expected, when the summers remain muted and the harvest does not recover, fear becomes less private. It moves from household to household. It enters marketplaces in the form of rising prices. It appears on roads as people search for work, charity, grain relatives, or refuge. It reaches cities as shipments fail to arrive on time or arrive in smaller quantities. In an age before modern refrigeration, global forecasting, industrial transport, and emergency food networks, a narrow margin separates stability from desperation. A society can look strong in stone and ceremony, while being dangerously dependent on a few good seasons. The sky itself becomes part of the record. Ancient writers describe a sun without brightness, a year when warmth seems absent, a strange dimness that unsettles the imagination as much as the body. Some accounts are brief, shaped by local experience, religious interpretation, or the writer's own purpose. None should be treated as perfect weather reports. Yet they converge with another archive, one that no chronicler intended to write. Trees growing in the northern hemisphere record narrow rings, in these years signs of cold and stress. Ice from Greenland and Antarctica preserves traces of volcanic sulfate, the chemical fingerprint of explosive eruptions powerful enough to affect the atmosphere. The evidence remains incomplete, but it is difficult to ignore. Around the middle of the 6th century, something enormous happens to the climate. The world into which that shock arrives is not simple. It is a world of emperors and village headmen, imperial capitals and isolated farms, written law and oral memory armies on frontiers and traders at ports. In Constantinople, the Roman Empire in the East still imagines itself as the rightful heart of a universal order, even as it fights exhausting wars and tries to hold distant territories together. In Persia, the Sasanian Empire commands wealth armies, irrigation court culture, and a rival vision of power. Across Western Europe, kingdoms formed in the ruins of Roman authority continue to harden into new political realities. Farther east steppe peoples, Chinese dynasties, Central Asian merchants and South Asian polities live within their own shifting worlds of ambition, faith exchange, and conflict. No single explanation can gather all of them into one tidy pattern, yet climate has a way of entering history without asking permission. It does not need to conquer a city to weaken it. It can shorten a growing season, disrupt pasture, drive up food prices, push hungry people into motion, and make governments appear less capable than they claim to be. It can turn ordinary tensions into crises. It can make a war more expensive, a tax more resented, a migration more urgent, a rumour more believable, a plague more devastating. The darkened sky is not a villain with intention. It is more unsettling than that. It is an indifferent pressure applied unevenly across human lives. In some places the change may be dramatic, in others barely noticed. This unevenness matters. The ancient world is full of microclimates, local buffers, stored wealth, political choices and human improvisation. A valley with reserves might endure what a marginal farming zone cannot. A port with access to multiple grain sources might survive while an inland region starves. A powerful state might redirect resources, but only if its road ships administrators and legitimacy still hold. A village might adapt by changing crops, eating different foods, slaughtering animals earlier, moving settlement relying on kin networks, or simply waiting through misery with no historian nearby to record it. That is part of what makes the era feel lost. Much of the suffering leaves no voice. The people most exposed to hunger are often the least likely to appear in surviving texts. Their experience survives indirectly in abandoned sites, altered diets, reduced building activity, changes in burial practice, or the silence of places where evidence has been erased by time. Written sources often come from elites, clerics, officials, or later compilers who see disaster through theology, politics, or moral warning. The ground tells another story, but it speaks slowly and often in fragments. Still, the outline of the mystery is clear enough to haunt the imagination. A volcanic veil spreads through the atmosphere. Temperatures fall, harvests falter, societies strain. Then disease arrives in parts of the Mediterranean world with terrifying force. Wars continue, borders tremble, cities lose population. Old systems survive in some places, transform in others, and fail elsewhere. The late antique world does not collapse overnight, but it changes shape under pressure. The darkness becomes one thread in a larger unravelling, and perhaps also in a larger weaving of something new. The lost era after the sky turned dark begins then not with one city burning or one king dying, but with a change in the light. It begins with people looking upward and finding no answer. It begins with fields that do not warm, trees that do not grow as they should, ships waiting under uncertain skies, rulers demanding taxes from lands with less to give, and ordinary families measuring survival one meal at a time. Above them all, high beyond sight, the atmosphere carries the memory of fire. Before the darkness falls, the old world still appears solid enough to trust. Its roads still carry officials, merchants, soldiers, pilgrims, tax collectors, letters, rumours, and small bundles of hope tied in cloth. Its harbours still breathe with the movement of ships, their hulls heavy with grain, wine oil, timber, cloth, metalwork, spices, glass slaves, ivory manuscripts, and all the ordinary cargo of a connected age. Its cities still rise above the countryside with walls, markets, churches, temples, baths, workshops, granaries, palaces, warehouses, and streets polished by generations of feet. To anyone standing inside that world, it does not look like a fragile thing. It looks old, layered, difficult, sometimes violent, often unfair but not temporary. The people living through the decades before the sky turns strange do not think of themselves as standing near the edge of an era. They wake into systems inherited from the past. In the Eastern Mediterranean, the Roman Empire still endures in its Eastern form, wealthy, ambitious, bureaucratic, and deeply conscious of its own antiquity. Constantinople sits like a hinge between continents, guarding the Bosporus, drawing grain and taxes from provinces projecting authority through law, ceremony, diplomacy, and war. Its rulers command fleets and armies, but they also command paperwork, and in a world of fragile transport, paperwork can be its own kind of power. Orders move outward from the capital. Reports return. Accounts are kept. Officials calculate how much land can yield and how much people can bear. Farther east, the Sasanian Empire holds a different kind of grandeur. Persia is not a shadow on Rome's frontier, but a rival civilization with its own courtly rituals, noble families, military traditions, religious institutions, fortified cities, and agricultural heartlands. Between Rome and Persia lie zones of conflict and exchange, where fortresses watch desert routes, merchants cross cultural boundaries, and border peoples learn to survive between powers that speak in the language of destiny. These two empires have fought before and will fight again. Their rivalry is ancient enough to seem almost like a feature of the landscape, as permanent as mountain ranges or river valleys. Yet every campaign consumes grain, animals, coin labour, and political patience. In Western Europe, the memory of Rome remains everywhere, but direct Roman rule has fractured into successor kingdoms. Goths, Franks, Burgundians, Lombards, Anglo-Saxons, and others are not simply invaders moving across a blank map. They are rulers, warriors, farmers, negotiators, converts, rivals, and builders of new political worlds inside the ruins and surviving habits of the old. Roman roads still matter. Roman walls still shelter towns. Roman law titles, taxes, coins. Christianity and prestige continue to shape power long after imperial authority has faded in the West. The result is not a clean fall into darkness, but a complicated afterlife. Old institutions decay in some places, adapt in others, and become the raw material for new identities. The countryside supports all of it. This is easy to forget because stone ruins last longer than fields. Cities leave walls, farms leave thinner traces, yet the late ancient world depends on peasants, tenants, estate, labourers, herders, millers, charcoal burners, fishers, vineyard workers, irrigation keepers, and families who understand the soil by touch rather than theory. Their work feeds courts and armies. Their surplus pays taxes. Their animals pull carts, ploughs, and wagons. Their seasonal labour is the quiet engine beneath the visible world. A palace may display gold marble silk and theological confidence, but its survival begins with weather and harvest. This dependence is not unique to one region. Across Eurasia and North Africa, societies organize themselves around land, water, labor storage, and movement. In the Nile Valley, the rhythm of flood and field has shaped civilization for millennia, though by this period it is woven into imperial taxation and Mediterranean grain supply. In the Levant villages, towns, monasteries, ports, and caravan routes connect local production to wider systems. In Anatolia and the Balkans, roads and military corridors carry both commerce and danger. In Central Asia, oasis towns draw life from irrigation, and trade serving as meeting places for languages, religions, fabrics, horses, precious goods, and news from distant courts. In China, dynastic divisions and reunifications create their own cycles of strain and recovery, with state power deeply tied to grain rivers, canals, armies, and the moral meaning of order. The world before the darkness is therefore connected, but connection brings vulnerability as well as wealth. A ship that carries grain can also carry rats, fleas, and disease. A road that moves an army can also move refugees. A tax system that feeds a capital can drain a province during a poor harvest. A market that offers imported food in normal years can fail brutally when several regions suffer at once. What looks like strength in a prosperous season may become a weakness when the climate turns hostile. The evidence remains incomplete, but late antique societies often live with narrow buffers. Storage exists, charity exists, state intervention exists, religious support exists, and local adaptation exists. Yet none of these guarantees safety when multiple shocks arrive together. There are already signs of strain before the sky darkens. Wars have not waited for the volcano. Political legitimacy is contested in many regions. Some cities are smaller than they once were. In parts of the former Western Empire, long-distance trade has changed character, becoming less dense or more regionally focused. Taxation can be heavy, especially where governments need soldiers and fortifications. Frontier zones are restless. Elites compete for land and influence. Religious disputes sharpen social divisions, sometimes in language that sounds theological, but carries political weight. No single explanation fully accounts for the transformations underway. The old world is not healthy in every place, but neither is it simply dying. It is changing, and change is always easier to identify after the fact than while it is happening. For ordinary people, the age is not an abstraction. It is the price of bread. It is the distance to the nearest market. It is whether an ox survives winter. It is whether a son is taken for military service, whether a daughter marries into a household with land, whether a landlord demands more than the harvest can support, whether a monastery offers food, whether a tax collector arrives before the grain is threshed. It is also the smell of olive presses the dust of threshing floors, the creak of cart wheels, the bright noise of a market day, the smoke of cooking fires at dusk, and the comfort of repeated routines. Civilizations are often described through rulers and battles, but they are lived through habits. That is why the coming darkness matters so deeply. It does not strike an empty world. It enters a world already full of obligations, ambitions, debts, roots, rivalries, memories, and expectations. A farmer expects the season to turn. A merchant expects the port to open. A ruler expects taxes to arrive. A soldier expects supplies. A city expects grain. A priest expects meaning to be found in disaster. A family expects that hardship, however cruel, will still obey some familiar pattern. The sky's dimming disrupts more than weather. It disrupts trust. In the years before the catastrophe, the sun still appears reliable. Crops still rise in their appointed months, often enough for people to plan around them. Empires still imagine campaigns. Kings still bargain, threaten, marry, betray, and convert. Monks copy texts by lamplight. Artisans shape metal and glass. Sailors watch winds. Caravan leaders study wells. Children learn the paths between fields and homes without knowing that historians will one day look back on their time as a threshold. The world is not peaceful, but it is legible. Its dangers are known dangers. Its uncertainties are old uncertainties. Then beyond the horizon of human expectation, the air begins to change. The year without summer does not announce itself with a single universal sign. It arrives unevenly, as disasters often do, through delays, oddities, and small violations of expectation. A morning frost where frost should no longer come. A wind that feels too sharp for the season. A sky that looks washed out, not storm dark, not night dark, but dimmed in a way that makes people pause in doorways and stare upward. The strangeness is not merely that the air is cold. Cold has a place in the year. The strangeness is that the year itself seems confused, as if spring has forgotten its task and summer has lost its strength before it begins. Across parts of the northern hemisphere, trees respond before people understand. Their growth slows. Rings narrow inside their trunks, marking stress in wood, so quietly that no living observer can read the warning. Centuries later, those rings will become one of the strongest clues that the middle of the 6th century contains an extraordinary climatic disturbance. But for the people alive, then the evidence is not hidden in trees. It is in fields that fail to thicken vines, that struggle pastures that remain thin, and animals that enter the warm months with less to graze. It is in the anxiety of watching clouds move across a pale sun and wondering whether the crop has enough time left to ripen. The most famous descriptions come from writers who notice the sun itself. They describe a light without brilliance, a sun that shines weekly a year, when shadows seem changed and warmth fails to gather. Such accounts cannot be read as perfect scientific instruments. Ancient writers shape events through language, belief, and purpose. Some emphasize divine warning. Some see disorder in the heavens as a reflection of disorder on earth. Some may compress memory or rely on reports from elsewhere. Yet the records remain striking because they fit so well with physical evidence found far beyond the reach of any chronicler's imagination. Ice preserves volcanic sulfate. Trees preserve cold. Together they suggest that something entered the high atmosphere and stayed there long enough to disturb the ordinary exchange between sunlight and earth. The mechanics are invisible but powerful. A major explosive eruption can inject sulfur gases into the stratosphere, where they form tiny reflective aerosols. These particles do not block the sun like a curtain drawn across a window. Their effect is subtler and more global. They scatter and reflect part of the incoming solar radiation cooling the surface below. The result can be a dimmer sky-altered rainfall, colder summers, shorter, growing seasons, and a chain of regional weather disruptions that varies from place to place. The ancient world has volcanoes, of course. People living near them know fire ash shaking ground and choking air. But the idea that a mountain's explosion could cool distant continents belongs to a later age of instruments, satellites, chemistry, and climate models. In the 6th century, the catastrophe is experienced as disorder. A farmer does not need to understand atmospheric aerosols to know that grain heads are small. A herder does not need a climate reconstruction to see that animals are lean. In highland regions and northern zones, a few degrees of summer cooling can become a crisis. Crops that require a certain stretch of warmth may not mature. Hay may be insufficient for winter. Seeds saved for planting may be eaten because hunger is more immediate than next year's hope. In marginal landscapes where cultivation already presses against the edge of what climate allows, the difference between a difficult year and a disastrous year can be painfully narrow. Even in more fertile regions, the shock is dangerous because societies depend on timing. Agricultural life is not simply about whether rain falls or the sun shines. It is about sequences. Soil must become workable. Seeds must be sown within a window. Warmth must arrive at the right stage. Rain must come neither too heavily nor too sparsely. Harvest must happen before rot, frost war, or taxation destroys the yield. When the calendar loses reliability, labour becomes harder to organise. People may plant too early and lose seedlings, plant too late and lose ripening time, or watch fields survive only to produce less than expected. What survives in the record suggests that the anomaly is not just a local bad harvest. It is broad enough and severe enough to leave signatures across multiple natural archives. The year without summer also has a psychological force. In agrarian societies, the sky is not background. It is an active presence in daily life, a source of blessing, fear, pattern, and meaning. When the light changes, people interpret it through the intellectual tools available to them. Some may see divine anger. Some may suspect omens of war, plague, or political failure. Some may turn to processions, fasting offerings, repentance, or intensified prayer. Others may focus on practical adjustments, counting, grain, repairing, storage, reducing consumption, bargaining for supplies. These responses are not opposites. In the ancient world, practical survival and sacred interpretation often move together. A community can pray for mercy while also grinding inferior grain, slaughtering animals, and sending messengers to find food. The dimming does not fall equally on every household. Wealth softens disaster for a time. Landowners with stores can endure longer. Officials may requisition supplies. Monasteries and religious institutions may have networks of support. Merchants with access to distant goods may profit or survive, though trade itself is vulnerable to disruption. Poor families feel the crisis quickly. Labourers paid in food tenants with obligations, smallholders with little surplus widows, orphans migrants, and the landless stand closest to the edge. In any age, disaster reveals the social structure more clearly than prosperity does. Hunger travels along lines already drawn by power. A lesser-known detail hides inside the way cold affects not only fields but movement. Rivers may freeze differently. Mountain passes may remain dangerous longer. Pasture cycles shift. Animals used for transport weaken when fodder runs low. Ships can still sail beneath a dim sun, but ports rely on predictable production inland. A cooling event can therefore disturb movement without destroying roads or harbours directly. Goods may exist in one region and be desperately needed in another, yet the systems that connect them can become slower, more expensive, or more dangerous. Scarcity does not have to be absolute to become deadly. It only has to arrive where access is poor and reserves are thin. The strange weather also leaves room for contradiction. Some regions may become wetter, others drier. Some may suffer severe cold, others mostly disrupted rainfall or dimmed growth. A volcanic climate shock does not create one identical disaster everywhere. This unevenness partly explains why scholars still debate the exact historical consequences. A chronicle from one place may describe misery, while archaeology elsewhere shows continuity. A city may decline for reasons only partly related to climate. A rural settlement may persist quietly through decades that later historians describe as catastrophic. The evidence remains incomplete and caution matters. The sky darkens, but history beneath it remains complex. Still, the timing is difficult to dismiss. Around the year 536, the Northern Hemisphere appears to enter one of the sharpest short-term cooling episodes of the last 2 millennia. It is followed by further volcanic signals suggesting that the world may not have faced a single blow, but a sequence. If one weakened, summer can be survived, several bad years can alter decisions, debts, health, fertility, migration, and trust. A dim year becomes a hungry year. A hungry year becomes a vulnerable year. Vulnerability opens doors to disease, conflict, and political fracture. So the year without summer stands not as a neat apocalypse, but as a threshold. The old routines do not disappear immediately. People still sow, grind, carry trade, pray, command, obey, resist, and hope. Yet the light above them has changed, and with it the confidence that the world will continue to behave as it did before. The sun returns each morning, but it returns weakened. It hangs above fields, cities, roads, and frontiers like a warning no one can fully translate. Beneath that pale disk, the ancient world begins to count its losses. The ash that changes history does not always look like ash by the time it reaches the places where history is written. Near the erupting mountain, ash is physical and brutal. It buries roofs, poisons, water strips leaves from trees, and turns daylight into choking grey. Far away, however, the most important part of the eruption may leave no visible dust on the ground at all. It rises higher into the thin upper atmosphere, transformed into a veil of sulfur particles, so fine and so widely dispersed that people beneath it see only its consequences. The sky looks wrong. The sun loses force. Summer weakens. No one in a village, city, monastery, or imperial court can climb high enough to see what the air has become. Modern evidence has to reach where ancient eyes could not. One of the clearest archives lies inside ice. In Greenland and Antarctica, layer upon layer of snowfall has accumulated and compressed across centuries, trapping traces of the atmosphere within frozen time. When researchers drill deep cores from these ice sheets, they read them almost as a climate manuscript, though one written without words. Some layers contain sulfate peaks, signs that explosive eruptions injected sulfur gases into the atmosphere. Other measurements may reveal tiny shards of volcanic glass, chemical hints that can sometimes be matched to particular volcanic regions. The record is not simple, and scholars still debate details, but Around the middle of the 6th century, the ice preserves evidence of major volcanic activity, powerful enough to disturb climate far beyond its source. This is one of the most important clues in the story of the darkened sky. Ancient writers describe strange sunlight, but written testimony alone can be ambiguous. A chronicler may exaggerate. A later copyist may introduce confusion. A local famine may become in memory a cosmic event. Ice cores do not solve everything, but they offer a separate line of evidence. They show that the atmosphere itself carries signs of eruption at the right time. When those signals are compared with tree rings, lake sediments, and historical accounts, the picture becomes harder to dismiss. Something happened in the high air, and it was not merely a metaphor for troubled times. The tree ring evidence adds a living dimension to the frozen one. Trees grow year by year, widening their trunks in response to warmth, moisture, sunlight, and stress. In favourable years, rings tend to be wider. In harsh years, they narrow. Across parts of the northern hemisphere, trees record sharp cooling and poor growth in the years after the sky darkens. Some high-latitude and high-altitude trees are especially sensitive because their growing seasons are already short. A cold summer leaves a mark that may remain hidden for more than 1,000 years, until a scientist cuts cause measures and compares it with other trees from distant places. The result is a pattern of stress broad enough to suggest a hemispheric event. The surprising detail is how quietly such evidence survives. The world that suffered the dimming may leave behind dramatic stories of famine and fear, but the most reliable witnesses are often silent things: a line of sulfate in ice, a compressed ring of wood, a microscopic fragment of glass, a change in pollen, a shift in sediment. These traces do not care about empire theology, blame, or memory. They record physical disturbance, yet even they require interpretation. Ice can show that sulfate arrived, but not always exactly which volcano produced it. Tree rings can show stress, but stress may result from cold drought pests or a combination. Written records can show human perception, but perception is filtered through culture. No single archive is enough. The mystery has to be assembled from fragments that were never meant to fit together. The leading explanation points to large volcanic eruptions, perhaps more than one occurring close enough together to prolong the climatic disruption. One eruption may have darkened the sky in the year commonly associated with the first anomaly. Another major eruption only a few years later may have reinforced the cooling. This sequence matters because societies can often absorb one shock if recovery follows quickly. A single bad harvest may be endured through stored grain livestock trade, borrowing charity migration, or harsh rationing. But repeated shocks erode every buffer. Stores empty, animals are consumed, seed grain disappears, debts increase, bodies weaken, trust declines. A second eruption falling before recovery from the first can make the crisis feel less like an event and more like a new climate. The exact sources remain disputed. Some evidence has pointed researchers toward high-latitude eruptions, possibly in the northern hemisphere, where volcanic aerosols could have had strong regional effects. Other clues raise the possibility of tropical eruptions which can spread aerosols more evenly around the globe. Volcanic glass chemistry, sulfate distribution between Greenland and Antarctica, and climate modelling all play roles in this debate. Names of candidate volcanoes have appeared and faded as evidence improves. The record remains incomplete because eruptions do not always leave convenient signatures, and not every volcanic deposit has been identified, dated, or chemically matched with certainty. A mountain can change the world and still hide its name. This uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is part of the story. The darkened sky is one of those historical mysteries where the event is clearer than the culprit. People saw the sun dim. Trees slowed their growth. Ice recorded volcanic chemicals. Yet the actual eruption, the place where Earth opened and sent the future into the air, may have occurred far from the literate centres that preserved written history. It may have devastated communities whose own records did not survive. It may have happened in a region where ash deposits are buried, eroded, submerged, or still insufficiently studied. The catastrophe that altered empires may have begun in a landscape that imperial historians barely knew existed. The ancient world, meanwhile, interprets the haze from below. In Constantinople, in rural Anatolia, in Italy, in Gaul, in Syria, in the Balkans, and across many regions where evidence survives unevenly, the dimming enters human explanation through older habits of thought. A strange sun may be a sign of divine displeasure, a warning of war, a herald of plague, or a symbol of moral disorder. These interpretations are not scientific, but they are historically important. They shape response. They influence how rulers present themselves, how religious leaders speak to communities, how frightened people understand suffering, and how later generations remember the crisis. A volcanic aerosol layer does not only cool fields, it also cools confidence. The atmosphere itself becomes a bridge between geology and politics. An eruption is a geological event, but once its aerosols spread, it becomes agricultural, economic, social, military, religious, and psychological. It alters the probability of harvest failure. Harvest failure affects tax revenue. Tax revenue affects armies. Armies affect borders. Borders affect migration and war. Hunger affects immunity. Weakened bodies face disease differently. Rumours spread faster in fear. A sky dimmed by sulphur can therefore enter a palace treasury, a village granary, a soldier's ration, and a burial ground without leaving a visible layer of ash in any of them. Still, caution remains necessary. It would be too simple to say that volcanoes caused the transformation of the late ancient world. They did not act alone. Wars were already underway. Political rivalries already existed. Trade routes already carried risk. Social inequality already shaped who suffered first and longest. Disease had its own ecology. Human choices mattered at every step. But the volcanic evidence shows that the world faced an external shock of unusual scale. The sky did not darken because people imagined it. The cold was not merely literary. Something in the earth had reached into the heavens, and the heavens had answered by withholding warmth. So the ash in the high air becomes the hidden architecture of the crisis. It is unseen by those who endure it, yet it frames their seasons. It turns the sun into a pale disk, shortens summer's generosity, and makes the ordinary bargain between labour and harvest less reliable. The eruption's source may remain debated, its human consequences uneven, its memory scattered across chronicles and frozen chemistry. But its presence is there, suspended above the old world, fine as breath, and vast as empire. Hunger begins in the field before it reaches the table. It begins while the plants are still standing, while there is still a chance that warmth might return, while people still walk the rows and try to read the future in stems, leaves, grain heads, and damp soil. A harvest can fail long before the sickle touches it. It can fail in the cold pause after sowing, when seed waits in earth that refuses to wake. It can fail in a late frost that blackens tender growth overnight. It can fail in too much rain, not enough rain. Thin sunlight, shortened summer mildew, rot insects, exhausted soil, or a ripening season that ends too soon. The disaster does not need to destroy everything. It only needs to reduce enough in enough places for fear to move faster than carts can carry food. In the years after the sky turns dim, ordinary agriculture becomes a contest against uncertainty. The ancient farmer is already accustomed to risk. No one who depends on weather expects kindness every year. But experience teaches patterns, and patterns are what make survival possible. There are known bad years, and known remedies open the stores. borrow grain slaughter, a few animals gather wild foods, reduce meals, delay payments, appeal to a landlord, a monastery, a patron, a relative, a local official, or a god. The trouble with a climate shock is that it can damage the patterns themselves. When cold reaches into the growing season, when harvests are poor across neighbouring regions, when the next year does not restore confidence, the old remedies begin to fail. The first visible sign may be caution. Families grind grain more carefully, mixing poorer quality cereals with whatever can stretch the supply. Bread becomes darker, coarser, smaller. Porridge thins. Meat disappears from ordinary meals unless animals must be killed because there is not enough fodder to keep them alive. Milk declines when herds weaken. Seed grain becomes a moral and practical torment. To eat it is to survive the present at the cost of the future. To save it is to let hunger sharpen now in the hope that next season will be kinder. No chronicle needs to record such arguments for them to have happened countless times, beside storage jars in farmyards and under roofs, where smoke gathers in the rafters. The shortage spreads through social life. Prices rise in markets when grain is scarce, or when merchants believe it will become scarce. Those with coin buy early, those with power requisition, those with land hide stores if they fear seizure. Those without protection wait longer, pay more, eat less, or move. A city can feel the crisis as a change in sound. Fewer carts arriving at dawn, more voices at distribution points, more arguments near granaries, more strangers at gates. The poor do not experience famine only as lack of food. They experience it as humiliation, debt migration, disease, family separation, and the slow narrowing of choices. Rural hunger can be quieter and more invisible. A village may not collapse dramatically. It may simply shrink. A few households leave. A few children die. A few elderly people do not survive winter. A field is left untilled because there are not enough animals or labourers. Marginal land is abandoned first. Repairs are postponed. Tools are sold, pledged, or lost. Woodland foods, roots, nuts, leaves, fish, shellfish, birds, and small animals become more important where they are available. In some places, people adjust with ingenuity. In others, the environment gives little to improvise with. The evidence remains incomplete because hunger rarely leaves a single, clean, archaeological signature. It appears through patterns, changes in diet, stress marks on bones, settlement, contraction, storage pits, pollen shifts, and the absence of activity where activity once was. A lesser-known consequence of cold years is the pressure they place on animals. Ancient agriculture depends heavily on animal bodies. Oxen pull ploughs. Horses and mules move people messages and goods. Sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle provide meat, milk, wool hides, manure, and wealth that can be counted on 4 legs. When pastures remain poor and hay yields decline, animals become both resource and burden. Keeping them alive consumes fodder that may not exist. Killing them provides immediate food, but reduces future labour breeding milk transport and status. A weakened ox is not only an animal in distress, it is a delayed ploughing a smaller field, a poorer harvest, and a deeper vulnerability next year. The state feels this pressure in its own way. Empires and kingdoms do not eat symbols, they eat grain. Armies require rations. Capitals require shipments. Officials require tax revenue often assessed according to expectations formed in more normal times. A climate shock can make those expectations cruel. If collectors demand the usual amount from an unusual harvest, resentment grows. If rulers reduce demands, treasuries suffer. If armies are underfed, frontiers weaken. If cities go hungry, legitimacy trembles. In a world where rulers often claim to preserve order under divine favour, or inherited right, a failed food system can become politically dangerous. Hunger is never only biological. It becomes an argument about authority. Religious institutions stand in the middle of this pressure. Churches, monasteries, temples, shrines, and charitable networks may store food, distribute alms, interpret suffering, and preserve community cohesion. They can become lifelines, especially where state structures are distant or distrusted. Yet they too depend on land donations, labour, and harvests. Their ability to help is not infinite. In times of scarcity, sacred spaces may fill with petitioners whose needs exceed available resources. Prayers intensify, processions may multiply, fasting can become both devotion and grim necessity, and disaster may be framed as punishment, test, purification, or warning. What survives in the record suggests that people seek meaning, not because meaning fills the stomach, but because hunger without meaning is almost unbearable. The cold years also change bodies before they kill them. Malnutrition weakens immunity. It makes ordinary illness more dangerous. It increases vulnerability among children, pregnant women, the elderly, and those already poor. It can reduce fertility, slow recovery from injury, and leave marks in bones and teeth. When disease later moves through populations already stressed by shortage, its effects may deepen. No single explanation fully accounts for the relationship between climate hunger and epidemic disease, but it is difficult to separate them entirely. A hungry world is a more fragile world. And yet hunger does not mean universal helplessness. People adapt because they must. Some communities shift planting choices. Some rely more on hardy grains. Some expand pastoral movement. Some intensify fishing gathering or local trade. Some move toward better watered land or safer settlements. Some attach themselves to powerful patrons in exchange for protection. Some survive because one valley escapes the worst while another fails. Some survive because memory teaches them how to endure scarcity without assuming the end has come. Disaster is uneven, and unevenness creates both tragedy and survival. This is why the lost era cannot be reduced to darkness alone. The dim sun is the beginning of the pressure, not its whole story. Hunger translates climate into human consequence. It turns aerosols in the stratosphere into empty bowls, narrower faces, postponed marriages, abandoned fields, angry markets, weakened animals, and rulers suddenly discovering that authority depends on weather more than ceremony admits. The ash remains high above, but its shadow settles low in granaries, barns, kitchens, roads, and stomachs. Under the pale sky, the ancient world does not simply starve. It negotiates with scarcity, and every negotiation leaves it changed. Empires rarely admit that they are fragile. They speak in the language of command, inheritance, divine favor, military order, law, coinage, architecture, and ceremony. They build gates high enough to make a person feel small. They mint rulers' faces onto metal and send those faces across provinces where the ruler will never stand. They measure land, count households, levy troops, regulate trade, sponsor churches, punish rebels, and imagine that the world can be held together through administration and force. Yet beneath every imperial promise lies a quieter dependence. The palace depends on the granary, the army depends on the mule, the tax register depends on the harvest, the frontier depends on weather in fields far behind it. When the sky dims and harvests falter, this dependence becomes harder to hide. In Constantinople, the Eastern Roman state still possesses enormous resources compared with many of its neighbours. It has a capital of almost theatrical strength, defended by land walls, supplied by sea, enriched by taxation, and decorated with the confidence of an empire that still calls itself Roman. Its ruler in the 6th century, Justinian, imagines restoration on a grand scale. Imperial armies move westward to reclaim territories once ruled from Rome. North Africa is taken from the Vandals. Italy becomes the stage for a long and devastating war against the Ostrogoths. Imperial law is reorganized. Churches rise. Diplomats maneuver. The empire appears energetic, even resurgent. But energy is expensive. Campaigns consume more than courage. They consume grain fodder, ships, wages, weapons, horses, bureaucratic attention, and political tolerance. A war that seems glorious in court poetry can feel very different in a province asked to provide supplies after a poor season. The dimmed sun does not stop Justinian's ambitions at once, and it would be misleading to suggest that climate alone determines imperial policy. Scholars still debate how directly the weather crisis alters the empire's decisions. Yet the timing is grim. A state already stretched by war taxation, religious conflict, and the difficulties of ruling across seas now faces colder years and uncertain harvests. Its confidence remains visible, but the margin beneath that confidence narrows. To the east, the Sasanian Empire faces its own version of the strain. Persia is powerful, sophisticated, and deeply rooted in the agricultural wealth of Mesopotamia and Iran, where irrigation landed aristocracy's royal authority and military obligations bind society together. Its rivalry with Rome is not a temporary quarrel, but a long contest for prestige territory, influence, and security. Frontier wars flare, pause, and return. Fortified cities and desert routes become pieces in a game that neither empire can easily abandon. A climate shock does not erase Persian strength, but it presses on the same foundations: food, labor taxation, and the loyalty of elites whose power depends on land and armed following. The two great empires do not suffer in isolation. Their rivalry itself becomes part of the vulnerability. When resources are abundant, war is destructive but possible. When harvests are poor, war becomes a sharper gamble. Soldiers still need to eat. Horses still need fodder. Garrisons still expect pay. Sieges still strip surrounding land. Refugees still move along roads. Border communities still carry the first weight of imperial decisions made far away. A cold year can make every strategic choice harsher because no ruler can pause the needs of an army while waiting for the sun to recover. Across Western Europe, the old Roman frame has already changed, but the dimmed era still reaches into the new kingdoms. The Frankish realms, Gothic Italy, Visigothic Spain, and other post-Roman societies are not uniform. Some retain Roman administrative habits. Others rely more visibly on warrior elites, regional power, kinship landholding, and negotiated authority. Their rulers need harvests just as emperors do. They need gifts for followers, food for court's revenue from land and legitimacy in a world where kingship is personal as much as institutional. A poor harvest can weaken a king's generosity. A weakened generosity can loosen loyalty. The chain is not automatic, but it is dangerous. Italy offers one of the era's most painful examples of overlapping pressures. The peninsula, once the symbolic heart of Roman power, becomes a battlefield in Justinian's attempt to restore imperial rule in the west. War between imperial forces and the Ostrogoths devastates regions already vulnerable to political disruption. Cities are besieged, countryside is stripped, infrastructure suffers, and populations endure repeated violence. When climatic stress and food shortage are added to war, the suffering deepens. The evidence remains incomplete, and not every decline can be attributed to the darkened sky, but the combination is devastating. Fields disturbed by armies, taxes demanded by competing authorities, trade disrupted, and ordinary people trapped between imperial visions and local survival. Farther north and west, where written records are thinner, the climate signal must be traced more carefully. Tree rings suggest cold. Archaeology shows regional variation. Some settlements continue, some landscapes reorganize, Some elites maintain power through adaptation. In parts of Scandinavia, for example, later evidence has encouraged scholars to consider whether severe 6th century cooling contributed to social stress settlement changes and memories of a terrible winter preserved in much later tradition. The idea is compelling, but must be handled cautiously. Myth is not a weather station, and later stories cannot be read as direct reports. Still, the possibility that climate trauma leaves deep cultural echoes is difficult to ignore. Beyond Europe and the Near East, the same broad climate anomaly may touch societies whose records follow different rhythms. In Central Asia, where oasis agriculture, pastoral movement, and long-distance exchange depend on delicate balances of water, pasture and political security climate stress can alter roots and relationships. Steppe peoples respond to pasture conditions, herd health, and opportunities created by weakened neighbours. Movement across the steppe is often described from the viewpoint of settled empires as invasion or pressure, but from within nomadic and semi-nomadic worlds, it may also be adaptation strategy or survival. A colder, disrupted climate does not automatically send horsemen across borders, but it can change the calculations of mobility. In China, the 6th century belongs to a complex age of division and eventual movement toward reunification. Northern and southern regimes, military households, agrarian systems, frontier peoples, and court politics interact in ways that cannot be reduced to a single environmental cause. Yet climate instability matters there too, because Chinese political thought often links cosmic order weather harvest and legitimacy. A ruler who cannot secure grain control floods, manage drought, or protect the people risks more than administrative failure. He risks appearing morally and cosmically weakened. What survives in the record suggests that unusual weather, famine, and disorder are often interpreted through this moral political lens where heaven, earth, and rulership are bound together in expectation. The darkened sky therefore becomes a test that no empire has chosen. Its pressure is not equal, and its results are not uniform. Some governments respond with redistribution, command storage, or ritual. Some intensify taxation just when people can least bear it. Some use crisis to strengthen authority. Others lose ground to rivals, rebels, disease, or exhaustion. A strong state can sometimes soften famine by moving food across regions, but this requires functioning roads, ships, officials, security, and surplus somewhere. If the crisis is too broad, even a capable state finds itself moving scarcity rather than abundance. There is also the problem of belief. Empires do not rule only through soldiers and taxes. They rule through stories about order. Rome promises law and universal authority. Persia promises royal splendor and cosmic balance. Christian kingdoms promise sacred kingship, protection, and salvation woven into earthly power. Chinese dynasties promise harmony between heaven and rule. When the sky darkens, these stories come under strain. People may not immediately blame a ruler for the sun's weakness, but they may judge how power responds. Empty granaries can make theology sharper. Failed harvests can turn political criticism into moral accusation. Disaster invites interpretation, and interpretation can become dangerous. Still, it would be too neat to picture the great powers simply breaking beneath the dim sun. Many institutions endure. Armies continue to march. Coins continue to circulate. Laws continue to be issued. Churches, courts, and markets continue to function. This endurance is part of the drama. The lost era is not a sudden silence after a single blow. It is a world still moving, while wounded, still ambitious, while weakened, still speaking the language of permanence, while its foundations are being tested by cold hunger and fear. The sky above the empires is pale, but the imperial machine does not stop. It grinds onward, demanding food from thin fields and loyalty from anxious people. Under that dimmed light, the old powers reveal both their strength and their limits. They can command armies, but not warmth. They can build walls, but not seasons. They can punish tax evasion, but not make grain ripen on time. The catastrophe does not abolish empire. It exposes the bargain empire has always made with the natural world, a bargain hidden during good years and mercilessly clear during bad ones. And as the cold years continue, another force begins to move through the weakened landscape, one that does not care about borders, titles, or imperial dreams. Disease enters history differently from cold. Cold can be seen in frost felt in the skin, measured in failed growth and empty barns. Disease moves first as rumour, then as fever, swelling, breathlessness, terror and absence. It travels inside bodies, inside fleas, inside the holds of ships, inside the fur of rats, inside the crowded spaces where trade and hunger have already drawn people together. By the time a community fully understands that something more than ordinary illness has arrived, the sickness may already be passing from house to house, street to street, port to port along the same routes that once made the world feel prosperous and connected. In the years after the sky turns dark, the most infamous disease event of the age appears in the Mediterranean world, the plague associated with Justinian's reign. It does not arrive in a world at ease. It comes after climate shock, after poor harvests in many places amid war movement, taxation, weakened bodies and anxious interpretation. The disease is commonly identified by modern scholars as bubonic plague caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, though the precise scale mortality and long-term consequences remain debated. Ancient accounts describe a terrifying epidemic, but they were written by people trying to make sense of horror, not by modern epidemiologists counting cases with standardized methods. The evidence remains incomplete and caution is necessary. Yet there is little doubt that a major pandemic strikes parts of the late antique world with devastating force. The disease likely moves through networks that earlier generations would have seen as signs of strength. Ports link provinces, grain shipments feed capitals, merchants connect distant regions, armies move across frontiers and seas, animals live close to people, storage facilities attract rodents, urban neighbourhoods concentrate bodies in dense quarters. The same connected world that allows an empire to gather food taxes and information also allows pathogens to move. This is one of history's dry ironies. Systems built to bind civilization together can become corridors for its suffering. In Constantinople, the plague becomes part of imperial memory. The great capital, already dependent on supplies from beyond its walls, is especially vulnerable to any disease that rides with commerce. A city of such size cannot isolate itself easily from the routes that sustain it. Food must arrive, ships must dock, workers must unload cargo, markets must function. Officials must record, regulate, and respond. When sickness spreads in a place like this, it does not merely kill individuals, it interrupts the rhythm of an imperial machine. Burial becomes a problem. Labour becomes scarce. Fear empties streets or fills churches. The empire's centre remains standing, but it is forced to reveal something all great cities conceal during ordinary times. Their survival depends on countless fragile acts repeated every day by people who can vanish quickly. The symptoms described in ancient sources often include swellings, fever, and rapid death details consistent with bubonic plague, though not every report can be treated as clinically precise. Modern genetic evidence from early medieval burials has strengthened the identification of Yersinia pestis in several regions, showing that plague was indeed present in Europe during this broad period. Still, scholars debate how far the pandemic spread, how many people it killed, and how much it changed the course of history. Older views sometimes imagined a catastrophe so immense that it nearly single-handedly shattered the Mediterranean world. More recent approaches tend to be more careful, emphasizing regional variation, uncertain numbers, and the danger of letting dramatic text stand in for the experience of every place. That caution matters because plague-like climate is uneven. A port may be devastated while an inland village escapes the first wave. A region with dense trade connections may suffer earlier than a more isolated one. Some communities may lose a large share of their population. Others may experience milder outbreaks or none that can be detected. The disease may return in waves over generations, each time entering a changed social landscape. Mortality is not only a number. It is the death of a miller whose skill is needed, a sailor who knew a route, a tax official whose records no one can easily replace, a mother whose children survive without her, a bishop whose authority held a town together, a farmer whose field goes untilled, a soldier missing from a frontier garrison. Hunger and disease are not the same disaster, but they may strengthen each other. Malnutrition weakens bodies. Displacement brings strangers into new contact. Desperate trade for food can increase movement when caution would advise stillness. War gathers soldiers and camp followers into crowded conditions. Tax demands may force people to market even when sickness spreads. A climate crisis can disturb rodent populations and ecological balances, though the exact relationships between volcanic cooling animal hosts, flea vectors, and human plague outbreaks remain complex and debated. No single explanation fully accounts for the plague's emergence. It is better understood as a convergence of ecology, trade, climate instability, human movement, and chance. The psychological effect is immense. A cold sky suggests that the world is out of order. Plague makes that disorder intimate. The darkness above becomes fever inside the body. Communities that have already watched crops fail now watch neighbors die quickly and unpredictably. The social rules around death come under pressure. Proper burial, mourning, inheritance, care for the sick, and protection of the living all become harder when deaths multiply. Religious interpretation intensifies. Some see punishment, some seek intercession, some respond with charity and courage, others flee. Fear is not a moral failure in such a world. It is a survival instinct colliding with obligation. For rulers, plague is a crisis of manpower and legitimacy. Armies need recruits. Farms need labor. Tax systems need people alive and productive. Cities need workers to bake bread, carry water, clean streets, repair walls, sail ships, and maintain order. When mortality rises, the state may not collapse immediately, but its reach becomes more expensive. Land may go uncultivated. Wages and labor obligations may shift. Military campaigns may slow or become harder to sustain. In the Eastern Roman world, Justinian's wars continue, but they unfold in a society struck by disease and strain. The empire's ambition survives, yet survival is not the same as health. There is a lesser-known silence at the heart of plague history. The dead poor often disappear twice. First from life, then from the record. Elite writers may describe mountains of bodies or the terror of cities, but the names of most victims are lost. Archaeology can sometimes recover mass graves, emergency burials, unusual cemetery patterns, and ancient DNA, but these remains still represent fragments. The pandemic's true human shape lies beyond complete recovery. It is hidden in missing households, broken lines of inheritance tools left unused, children fostered elsewhere, fields absorbed by neighbors, and stories that were never written because the people who carried them did not survive. And yet plague does not end the world. This fact is grimly important. Societies continue after enormous mortality, though changed by it. Survivors inherit property, trauma, obligations, and opportunity. Some institutions weaken, others gain influence. Religious communities may become more central through care, burial, and interpretation. Local elites may consolidate land. Labour shortages may alter bargaining power in some places, though not uniformly. Trade routes may contract, then revive, then shift. The disease does not draw a clean line between ancient and medieval worlds, but it deepens the fracture already opened by cold hunger and war. The lost era after the sky turned dark therefore becomes more than a climate episode. It becomes a cascade. Fire enters the atmosphere, light weakens, harvests fail, bodies weaken, disease moves through the connected world. Empires continue to speak of order while their people count the dead. The plague that follows the darkness is not simply an added disaster. It is a force that exposes how tightly human health is bound to environment movement, animals, food, and power. Beneath the pale sun, the ancient world learns that survival can be threatened from above and from within, by particles too small to see in the sky, and by organisms too small to see in the blood. A city does not die the way a person dies. It does not take one final breath and fall still. It loses its pulse in intervals. A workshop closes and does not reopen. A public building is repaired with cheaper materials than not repaired at all. A street that once carried carts from dawn to dusk grows quiet except on market days. A bath complex cools its furnaces silent, its water channels blocked by silt. A theatre becomes a quarry for stone. A courtyard fills with makeshift structures. A grand house is divided into smaller spaces, then abandoned, then occupied again by people using only part of what earlier generations built. The city remains, but it no longer uses itself in the same way. In the lost era after the sky turns dark, urban decline is rarely a single event. It is a slow rearrangement of life under pressure. Late antique cities had always depended on flows from beyond their walls, grain from fields, taxes from estates, fuel from surrounding landscapes, water from aqueducts or wells, labour from countryside and slaves, animals from pastures, goods from roads and ships, authority from rulers and meaning from civic, religious and imperial traditions. When cold years reduce harvests, war interrupts movement, plague removes bodies, and political systems strain, the city feels all of it as a weakening rhythm. The gates still stand, the churches or temples still gather people. Officials may still sit behind desks, but the invisible circulatory system is damaged. Some cities survive with remarkable resilience. Constantinople, despite plague war and food stress, remains a major imperial capital. Its walls hold. Its harbours matter. Its court continues to radiate authority. Its position at the crossing of sea routes and land routes gives it advantages that smaller cities cannot match. But even a great city is not untouched. Epidemic mortality, supply uncertainty, administrative burden and military spending change the atmosphere of urban life. A capital may remain powerful while becoming more anxious, more militarized, more religiously intense, and more dependent on careful control of food and order. Survival in such a place is not the absence of crisis. It is the successful management of crisis long enough for continuity to appear from a distance. Elsewhere, the changes are sharper. Across parts of the Mediterranean and Western Europe, many cities that had once carried the dense public life of the Roman world become smaller, poorer, or differently organized. The pattern began before the climate shock in many areas, and no single explanation fully accounts for it. political fragmentation, changing trade networks, warfare, shifting elite habits, taxation, and the rise of new religious institutions all play roles. Yet the 6th century crisis adds weight to an already bending structure. A city that might have adapted slowly to changing imperial politics now faces food, shortage, disease, and insecurity at once. What survives in the archaeological record often suggests not sudden abandonment everywhere, but contraction, reuse, and simplification. The signs are subtle until they accumulate. Monumental construction declines in some regions. Imported ceramics become less common or more regionally limited. Coin circulation changes. Maintenance of large public works becomes harder. Aqueducts, roads, drains, and harbour facilities require labour expertise and authority. When those fade, infrastructure decays faster than stone walls alone would suggest. Urban populations may retreat into fortified cores, leaving outer districts less inhabited. In some places, burial grounds move closer to, or even within former urban spaces, a sign that older boundaries between the living city and the territory of the dead are shifting. The evidence remains incomplete, and each site has its own history, but the broader impression is of cities learning to live smaller. This shrinking is not always a failure. Sometimes it is adaptation. A reduced city may be more defensible, more manageable, more closely tied to a bishop's church, a fortress, a market, or a local ruler's residence. The classical city with its baths, theatres, councils, colonnaded streets, and civic monuments is not the only possible urban form. As older systems weaken, new centres of gravity appear. Churches become places of gathering charity, memory, storage, and authority. Bishops may negotiate with armies, distribute food, organize burial, ransom captives, and speak for communities when imperial officials are distant. In some towns, ecclesiastical buildings are not merely religious structures. They are the new skeleton around which urban life reorganizes. The plague deepens this transformation. A city struck by epidemic does not simply lose population, it loses confidence in proximity. Markets become frightening. Neighbours become possible sources of death. The care of the sick strains households. Burial overwhelms normal custom. Labour interruptions ripple through every practical function. If enough people die or flee, the city's daily maintenance falters. Streets are not cleaned as before. Goods are not unloaded at the same speed. Workshops lose skilled hands. The dead leave gaps in institutions that appear solid only because generations of ordinary labour have kept them moving. Disease reveals that a city is not its buildings. A city is a choreography of people. Food shortage changes that choreography too. Granaries become political spaces. Bread becomes a measure of legitimacy. Crowds gather not simply because they are unruly, but because survival often depends on public distribution market regulation, or the decisions of officials and elites. When supplies thin, a city may become more dependent on coercion and charity at the same time. Guards protect stores. Religious leaders preach endurance and offer relief where they can. Merchants are suspected of hoarding. The poor search for patrons. Migrants arrive from countryside where fields have failed only to find that cities have less to offer than their walls promise. A city can draw the hungry in precisely when it is least able to feed them. The quieter losses craft. Urban centres are repositories of specialised skill, glassmakers, metalworkers, scribes, masons, shipwrights, dyers, potters, physicians, accountants, builders of machines, repairers of mills, makers of fine textiles, and countless trades that require training across years. When population falls and demand shrinks, specialization becomes harder to sustain. Some crafts continue under elite military or religious patronage, Others become local, simpler or rarer. A broken supply chain can make a skilled artisan useless for lack of raw material. A collapsed market can end a craft without anyone intending to destroy it. The loss of urban pulse is also the loss of stored knowledge in human hands, and yet the ruins mislead if they are imagined as empty. Many late antique and early medieval cities are not deserted wastelands. People live among older stones, adapt them, quarry them, sanctify them, fear them, and forget their original purposes. A marble column may become building material. A Roman hall may become a church, a storehouse, a shelter, or a memory no one can fully explain. Children play beside fragments of inscriptions they cannot read. Farmers bring animals through gates once built for imperial processions. The city's past remains physically present but socially transformed. This is one of the most haunting features of the era. People do not always leave the old world behind by walking away from it. Sometimes they continue living inside it after its meanings have changed. The darkened sky does not alone empty the streets. It is one pressure among many working through harvest health movement and power. But in the story of cities losing their pulse, the climate shock matters, because urban life depends so heavily on surplus. Without surplus, grandeur becomes difficult. Without reliable movement, markets shrink. Without healthy bodies, labour falters. Without political trust, public order thins. The city can survive all of these for a time, but each one makes it less like the city it once was. So the lost era leaves its trace not only in dead trees and frozen sulfate, but in altered streets. The old avenues are still there, but fewer feet pass over them. The warehouses still cast shadows, but their contents are uncertain. The baths still remember warmth, but their fires are out. The walls still declare permanence, while inside them people improvise smaller lives among the remains of larger ambitions. Beneath the pale sun, the ancient city does not simply fall. It contracts, adapts, forgets, and waits its pulse faint but not gone. Broken roads do not always look broken. Their stones may still lie in place. Their milestones may still stand with names of dead emperors. Their bridges may still cross rivers in the old Roman way. But a road is not truly alive because stones exist. A road is alive when people trust it, when carts move with goods, when messengers travel with orders, when soldiers march with supplies, when pilgrims and traders expect shelter markets and law along the way. When that trust fades, even a paved road becomes uncertain country. Grass enters the cracks. Watchtowers lose men. Inns empty. Bandits appear where officials once passed. A route that once tied provinces together becomes a line of risk drawn across a frightened landscape. After the sky turns dark, the ancient world's roads do not fail all at once. They weaken through pressure. Hunger pushes people into movement. War makes movement dangerous. Plague makes strangers frightening. Cold years disturb the production of food and fodder, which means fewer animals strong enough to pull loads and fewer surplus goods worth carrying. A merchant may still know the road to a distant city, but knowledge is not enough if bridges are damaged. Tolls multiply, patrols vanish, or the countryside between markets can no longer feed travellers. The map in the mind remains while the lived reality becomes narrower. Borders feel this change first and most violently. Empires like to imagine frontiers as lines they control, but frontiers are really zones of negotiation, exchange, suspicion, and improvisation. Farmers live there. Traders cross there. Soldiers are stationed there. Local chiefs federate groups, tribal confederations, and imperial commanders bargain, threaten, intermarry, raid, defect, and return. In stable times, the frontier can be tense but manageable. In crisis, every weakness becomes an invitation. If an empire cannot pay troops reliably, if garrisons are thinned by plague, if local food supplies fail, if refugees crowd roads, then borders harden and blur at the same time. They become more defended in theory and more porous in practice. The word often used for peoples pressing against imperial boundaries is barbarian, but the word carries the viewpoint of states that wrote many of the surviving records. It can flatten a world of distinct communities into a single threatening mass. Goths, Franks, Lombards, Avars, Slavs, steppe groups, and many others do not exist merely as shadows outside civilization. They have their own politics, leaders, rivalries, economies, sacred traditions, memories and strategies. Some farm, some herd. Some fight for empires before fighting against them. Some migrate because opportunity appears. Some move because pressure leaves fewer choices. Some are drawn into imperial wars as allies, enemies, or both in succession. The evidence remains incomplete, especially where written records come from outsiders, but the old image of simple waves crashing into Rome hides more than it reveals. Climate stress can influence movement without dictating it. A cold period may reduce pasture in one region, shorten growing seasons in another, or weaken settled states enough to make raiding more profitable. But no single explanation fully accounts for migrations and military pressure. People move because of politics, ambition defeat alliance, population pressure, trade, marriage, violence, and rumour as well as environment. The dimmed sky is not a puppet master. It is a weight placed on an already unstable board, tilting pieces that were already in motion. In the Balkans, the 6th century becomes a landscape of repeated pressure. Imperial authority remains, but it is costly to maintain across mountains, rivers, forts, and roads exposed to raids and settlement shifts. Slavic-speaking groups and Avar power later transform much of the region, though the process is gradual, complex, and uneven. Forts may be repaired, abandoned, or overwhelmed. Rural communities adjust, flee, negotiate, or disappear from the record. The old Roman network of towns and roads does not vanish instantly, but it becomes harder to sustain. A frontier can be lost in documents long after it has already been lost in the habits of daily travel. In Italy, war turns roads into instruments of suffering. The struggle between Byzantine forces and the Ostrogoths drags through cities, farms, and supply lines, damaging the very land both sides claim to rule. Armies live off landscapes. They requisition grain, animals, and labour. They cut trees, seize buildings, occupy strongpoints, and leave behind hunger even when they do not intend permanent destruction. When climate stress and plague overlap with war, the road becomes more than a route for soldiers. It becomes a path for famine, refugees, disease, and rumour. A village near a military corridor may fear both enemy and ally because both require food. The eastern frontier between Rome and Persia carries another kind of tension. The great fortified cities and desert edges define a contest older than the darkened sky. But even an old rivalry changes under stress. Sieges become more punishing when food stores are uncertain. Border populations become more vulnerable when armies requisition supplies. Diplomatic payments, tribute, subsidies to allied peoples, and military logistics all require wealth that must come from somewhere. A weakened harvest in a province far from the battlefield can still shape the ability of a ruler to keep men armed at the edge of empire. The frontier is never only where soldiers stand. It extends backward into the fields that feed them. Farther north in regions with fewer written records, archaeology sometimes suggests disruption, reorganization, and shifts in settlement or elite display during and after the 6th century climate anomaly. In parts of Scandinavia, some scholars have argued that severe cooling may have contributed to abandoned farm social stress, and later cultural memories of a terrible winter before cosmic renewal. The idea is fascinating, but caution is necessary. Later myth cannot be used as a simple transcript of 6th century weather. Still, it may preserve the emotional shape of catastrophe, darkness, hunger, cold, and a world awaiting rebirth. Even when exact connections cannot be proven, the possibility shows how deeply environmental trauma can sink into imagination. Roads also carry belief. Pilgrims travel to holy places. Relics move between communities. Bishops send letters. Monks cross regions to found houses, debate doctrine, seek patronage, or flee violence. When travel becomes dangerous, religious geography changes. Some shrines become more local in importance. Some pilgrimage routes endure because devotion and desperation both drive movement. Some religious centers gain power as safe points in unstable landscapes. The broken road does not only affect commerce and war, it changes how people imagine protection, holiness, and distance. There is a lesser-known human detail in this world of strained movement information slows and distorts. In a well-connected system, news still arrives imperfectly, but it arrives often enough for rulers and merchants to plan. In a fractured system, rumor fills gaps. A plague in one port becomes a monstrous story in another. A raid becomes an invasion before anyone knows the size of the force. A famine elsewhere becomes a warning to hoard. A ruler's death, an army's defeat, a miracle, an omen. A new tax, a safe route, a dangerous bridge all move through voices before they become knowledge. Fear travels even when roads are blocked. Yet the roads are not entirely silent. People continue to move because life requires movement. Traders take risks for profit. Refugees move because staying is worse. Soldiers march because rulers command them. Messengers ride because delay can kill. Families relocate to kin or patrons. Captives are taken. Monks travel with books. Craftsmen follow demand. Herders seek pasture. The ancient world contracts, but it does not freeze. Its motion becomes more selective, more dangerous, more local in some places, and more militarized in others. Under the dim sky, roads and borders reveal the deeper transformation of the age. The old networks had made empires possible, but those networks depended on security, surplus labor, and trust. When cold, hunger, plague, and war weaken those foundations, movement becomes a test of power. A road may still run straight across the land, but the authority that once made it safe has thinned. A border may still be claimed by an emperor, but the people crossing it know claims are not the same as control. The lost era is therefore not only a story of darkened heavens. It is a story of distance returning to the world as places once joined by habit begin to feel far apart again. The mystery of the eruptions begins with a strange imbalance between consequence and identity. The consequence is visible across the world's natural archives: cold summers, narrow tree rings, sulfate in polar ice, and written memories of a sun that seems to shine without warmth. The identity is far less clear. Somewhere Earth opens with enough violence to lift material into the stratosphere, but the mountain itself remains elusive. It may have stood in a remote northern landscape, where ice, ocean, and sparse settlement swallowed much of its evidence. It may have risen in the tropics, where aerosols could spread widely between hemispheres. It may not have been one volcano at all, but a sequence of eruptions, each adding its own veil to the atmosphere before the world has time to recover from the last. This uncertainty gives the disaster an almost unsettling quality. Many ancient catastrophes have names attached to them. Vesuvius buries Pompeii, Thera reshapes the Bronze Age Aegean, Tambora darkens the year 1816, Krakatoa sends shockwaves around the globe. But the 6th century darkness resists such simplicity. The event is remembered by its shadow rather than its source. The world feels the wound while the blade remains partly hidden. Scholars still debate which volcano or which combination of volcanoes deserves the greatest responsibility, and every answer must pass through evidence that is powerful but incomplete. Ice cores provide the first pathway into the mystery, but they do not speak in plain language. A spike of sulfate in Greenland may suggest an eruption whose plume strongly affected the northern hemisphere. A matching signal in Antarctica may suggest a tropical source capable of spreading aerosols toward both poles. The size, timing, and chemistry of these signals matter. Researchers compare layers, count annual bands, measure acidity, examine trapped particles, and refine chronologies. Even then, dating uncertainty can shift interpretation by a year or more, and a single layer may contain material from complex atmospheric circulation rather than a simple one eruption story. The ice is an archive, but like all archives, it must be read carefully. Tiny volcanic glass shards called tephra can sometimes narrow the search. Each volcano has its own chemical character shaped by the magma beneath it. If microscopic glass in an ice layer matches known deposits from a volcano, the hidden culprit may step out of obscurity. But this process is difficult. The particles are minuscule. Deposits from many ancient eruptions are poorly sampled or unknown. A volcano may have erupted in a place where later ice water vegetation or erosion disturbed the evidence. Some candidate eruptions are known from geology but hard to date precisely. Others may have left no obvious surviving deposit on land, especially if much of the eruption fell into the sea. The evidence remains incomplete because the planet is not arranged for human convenience. Several broad possibilities have drawn attention. A high-latitude northern hemisphere eruption could explain strong cooling in northern tree ring records and the pronounced sulfate signal in Greenland. Such an eruption might have occurred in Iceland, Alaska, or another volcanic region near northern storm tracks. High-latitude eruptions can have intense regional effects, especially if their aerosols remain concentrated in one hemisphere. But a tropical eruption has its own appeal because tropical plumes may spread across both hemispheres and influence global climate more evenly. The distribution of sulfate between polar ice sheets, the timing of cooling, and the pattern of historical reports all become clues in a detective story written across air ice and wood. There is also the possibility of a 1-2 blow. The first eruption darkens the sky and triggers sharp cooling. A later eruption only a few years afterward reinforces or prolongs the climate downturn. This matters because people can sometimes absorb disaster if it is followed by relief. Stores can be rebuilt, herds can recover, debts can be repaid, trust can return. But repeated eruptions compress recovery time. They turn a shock into an interval, a bad year into a bad decade, a strange sky into a remembered age of disorder. The 6th century may have suffered not from one volcanic hammerstroke, but from several falling close enough together to change the human meaning of each. The popular imagination often wants a single villain. It wants a mountain with a name, a crater, an explosion, and a clear line running from eruption to famine, plague, migration, and collapse. History rarely grants that satisfaction. No single explanation fully accounts for the transformation of the late ancient world. Even if the volcanic source were identified with certainty, the eruption would still be only the beginning of the chain. Climate response varies by region. Human vulnerability depends on politics, storage, inequality, trade, health, and war. A cold summer in one place may be catastrophic. In another, it may be uncomfortable, but survivable. The volcano sets pressure in motion, but societies decide through structure and circumstance where that pressure breaks them. Still, the search for the eruption matters because it connects human history to planetary force. It reminds the ancient world is not sealed inside its own politics. The fate of a village in Gaul, a city in Syria, a farm in Scandinavia, a caravan town in Central Asia, or a court in Constantinople may be altered by an explosion none of them witness. The most important event in their lives may happen beyond their horizon in a language of magma, sulfur pressure, and wind. This is a humbling kind of history. It places emperors beneath volcanoes and empires beneath air. The absence of a confirmed culprit also protects the story from becoming too neat. A named volcano can become a false key, tempting every later event to be unlocked by one cause. Without that certainty, the historian must remain attentive to complexity. The darkened sky becomes a starting point, not an answer. It forces the question of how environmental shocks interact with already unstable systems. It asks why some regions bend and others break, why some communities disappear from the record while others continue, why a crisis is remembered in one tradition and barely visible in another. The mystery of the eruptions is therefore not only geological, it is historical, because uncertainty keeps the human world in view. What survives in the record suggests that the eruption or eruptions were among the most significant climate-forcing events of the last 2 millennia. Yet their source may have been obscure even to those living near them. A remote eruption might devastate local communities that leave no writing behind. A tropical island might be transformed in ways unknown to Mediterranean chroniclers. A northern volcano might send sulfur into the sky, while its ash falls across landscapes later altered by ice sea and time. The people closest to the blast may have understood it as the end of their own world, while those far away recorded only a pale sun and a failed harvest. In this way, the same catastrophe produces 2 kinds of silence. Silence at the source where evidence may be lost, and silence at a distance where people see effect without cause. The disputed and unsupported theories gather around such silence. Some popular accounts try to tie the darkened sky to exotic impacts, cosmic dust, or dramatic single-cause explanations that outrun the evidence. These ideas persist because mystery invites imagination, especially when the sun itself appears to have changed. But the mainstream evidence points most strongly toward major volcanic eruptions. The chemistry of ice, the behavior of tree rings, and the known climate effects of sulfur aerosols make volcanism the most grounded explanation. The unknown is not whether volcanoes matter. The unknown is which ones, how many, and exactly how their effects unfolded through the atmosphere and into human systems. So the hidden mountain remains at the center of the lost era like an unseen actor behind a curtain. Its eruption is not visible in the chronicles as fire, only as dimness. It is not recorded in imperial law, only in the pressure on fields and bodies. It does not march with armies, but it makes campaigns harder. It does not carry plague, but it helps shape the fragile world into which plague moves. It is a geological event that becomes a human condition, and until its source is known with certainty, the darkened sky keeps its deepest secret the place where the ancient air first turned against the sun. The clues to the darkened sky survive in places no 6th century witness could have imagined. They survive in the heartwood of old trees in the buried trunks of forests, long dead in the ice of Greenland and Antarctica, in lake mud laid down one thin layer at a time, in pollen, grains, glacier chemistry, and microscopic volcanic glass. They survive not as stories but as changes in growth chemistry and sediment preserved by processes indifferent to human memory. The people who endured the cold years looked upward and saw a weakened sun. The modern investigator looks downward and inward into wood, ice, and earth, trying to reconstruct an atmosphere that vanished more than 1,000 years ago. Tree rings offer one of the most elegant forms of evidence because they are both simple and profound. Each year of growth leaves a ring. In favorable conditions, many trees grow more. In harsh conditions, they grow less. The ring is not a diary, but it is a response, a physical memory of warmth, moisture, sunlight, and stress. In regions where growth is limited by summer temperature, especially near the edges of forests or high in mountains, a cold year can produce a narrow ring that stands out sharply against the years before and after. When thousands of trees from different places are compared, the result becomes a calendar of climate stress written in wood. The 6th century anomaly appears in these calendars as a period of remarkable cooling in parts of the northern hemisphere. Some tree ring records suggest that the years after the first darkened sky belong among the coldest intervals of the last 2 millennia. That phrase can sound abstract, but it means something very concrete. It means that summer warmth, the warmth on which grain pasture fruit and human confidence depend, falters across broad regions. It means that trees living far from imperial capitals respond to the same atmospheric disturbance that unsettles chroniclers closer to the Mediterranean. It means that the crisis is not only a literary image, it has entered biology. Yet tree rings must be handled with care. A narrow ring does not always mean cold. It can reflect drought, disease, competition, volcanic cooling, or several pressures at once. Some species respond more strongly than others. Some locations preserve better records than others. A forest may show a local crisis that cannot be treated as global. This is why researchers compare many records, test chronologies, and look for agreement across distance. The evidence remains incomplete, but when tree rings align with ice core sulfate and historical accounts of dim sunlight, their combined force becomes persuasive. Separate witnesses, none of them perfect, begin to speak in the same direction. Ice cores reveal another part of the story. They are not merely frozen water, they are layered archives of the atmosphere. Snow falls, compresses and traps chemical traces from the air. In some layers, researchers find sulfate concentrations far above background levels. These spikes are the afterimage of volcanic sulfur. Explosive eruptions can send sulfur dioxide high into the stratosphere, where it reacts to form sulfate aerosols. Eventually, some of that material settles, becoming preserved in ice sheets far from the eruption itself. A volcanic event that no historian names can therefore appear as a chemical scar near the pole. Sometimes the ice also holds tiny particles of volcanic glass. These shards are so small that their power lies not in size but in chemistry. Under analysis, their composition can hint at the magma that produced them. If matched to known volcanic deposits, they may help identify the source. But such matching is delicate work. Many volcanoes are not fully sampled. Some eruptions are poorly dated. Particles can be rare, contaminated, or difficult to distinguish. The ice can show that the atmosphere was disturbed, but it does not always reveal the mountain responsible. Scholars still debate several details, and that uncertainty keeps the investigation alive. Lake sediments add a slower earthbound archive. In lakes, fine material settles year after year, sometimes forming layers that can be counted and analyzed. Changes in sediment composition may reflect erosion, rainfall, temperature, vegetation shifts, or human land use. Pollen grains preserved in mud can reveal what plants grew in surrounding landscapes, and how those communities change through time. A cooling event may alter vegetation, shorten growing seasons, or affect erosion patterns, though the signal can be subtle and local. Sediments rarely provide the drama of a chronicle describing a dim sun, but they help show how climate shifts enter ecosystems and landscapes. Glaciers, too, can preserve memory. Their advance or retreat reflects longer patterns of temperature and snowfall. In a cold interval, glaciers may gain mass if conditions support accumulation. But glacier behavior is complex, shaped by precipitation, as well as temperature, and not every glacier responds immediately. Still, in combination with other evidence, glacier records can help sketch the broader environmental setting of the 6th century. The darkened sky becomes not a single observation, but a pattern emerging across archives with different weaknesses and strengths. The surprising thing is that the modern picture depends on both precision and humility. Science can measure sulfate in parts per billion datewood rings, year by year sequence ancient plague DNA, and model how aerosols move through the atmosphere. Yet it cannot restore every lost harvest, every local storm, every family decision, or every forgotten settlement. It can show that a climate shock happened. It cannot tell the full human story by itself. Historical reconstruction lives in the space between measurable signals and vanished lives. The ice gives chemistry, the trees give growth, the chronicles give fear interpretation, and sometimes exaggeration. Archaeology gives material change. None gives everything. Written records remain essential because they show how people notice the crisis. A pale sun in a chronicle is not only meteorology, it is perception. It tells that the change was visible enough to disturb educated observers and memorable enough to enter writing. But texts come with problems. They survive unevenly. They are copied, translated, excerpted, and framed by religious or political agendas. A writer in one city may report conditions from another. A phrase about darkness may be symbolic, literal, or both. Some regions with severe suffering may leave no written account at all. Others may produce dramatic descriptions that make their experience seem more universal than it was. The record must be listened to but not obeyed blindly. Archaeology grounds those words in lived spaces. It can show contraction of settlements, changes in building shifts in trade goods, altered burial practices, diet stress, or continued resilience, where written history expects collapse. It can complicate the story in valuable ways. A region described as devastated may show pockets of continuity. A place ignored by chroniclers may reveal significant transformation. The darkened sky does not flatten the world into one experience, and archaeology helps restore that unevenness. It shows that crisis is always local before it becomes historical. Together, these clues create a new kind of ancient history, one not limited to kings, wars, and chronicles. The lost era after the sky turned dark can be studied through the atmosphere itself, through the way trees tighten their rings, ice-captured volcanic breath lakes, stored environmental shifts, and bodies carried signs of hunger and disease. The past becomes wider than memory. It becomes planetary, and this wider past is unsettling. It shows that human history can turn on forces no one at the time understands. It shows that a year described by a frightened observer as sunless may correspond to chemistry frozen at the end of the earth. It shows that a village's failed crop and a tree's narrow ring may be different expressions of the same distant eruption. The old world did not know these connections. It lived inside them. Modern evidence does not remove the mystery, but it gives the mystery shape. Beneath the surface of wood and ice, the darkened sky is still there, waiting to be read. Survival in a changed landscape is rarely heroic in the way later stories prefer. It is quieter, more repetitive, and more exhausting. It is the decision to plant again after a failed harvest, even when the seed basket looks too light. It is the careful slaughter of an animal that would have been more valuable alive if the winter had been kinder. It is the gathering of foods once treated as marginal, the repair of a roof with poorer materials, the movement of a household closer to kin, water walls, pasture, or a patron. It is the narrowing of expectation without the surrender of life. Under the dim sky, many communities do not leave grand records of endurance. They simply continue, and that continuation is one of the most important facts of the age. The landscape after the climate shock is not transformed everywhere into ruin. That would be too simple. Some regions suffer sharply, others endure disruption but recover. Some settlements shrink, others become more important because they offer safety, storage, religious authority, or access to trade. Some farms are abandoned on marginal soils while better land remains in use. Some communities change what they grow, how they move animals, where they build, and whom they depend on. The evidence remains incomplete, but it suggests a world of uneven adaptation rather than universal collapse. Disaster does not erase human intelligence, it forces intelligence into harder forms. Food habits may change first. When preferred crops fail or produce poorly, people turn to hardier grains, pulses, gathered plants, nuts, fish, shellfish, game, dairy, where herds survive and whatever local ecology can provide. In some places, barley, rye, millet oats, or other resilient crops may matter more than prestige foods associated with wealth or urban markets. Bread may become darker and more mixed. Meals may become simpler, less varied, and more dependent on what grows reliably close by. A person's diet becomes a map of stress. It shows not only taste but access, class, climate, trade, and desperation. Archaeology sometimes catches these changes indirectly. Bones can reveal shifts in animal management. Plant remains can show what crops were processed or consumed. Human skeletons may preserve signs of nutritional stress, disease, childhood hardship, or heavy labor, though such evidence must be interpreted cautiously. Storage pits, hearths, grinding stones, fish bones, shell deposits, and pollen records all offer glimpses of adaptation. They rarely tell a neat story, but together they suggest communities adjusting their routines around scarcity. The most surprising detail is how much history may be hidden in refuse. A discarded bone, a charred seed, or a broken cooking pot can reveal more about survival than a royal decree. Settlement patterns also shift. In uncertain times, exposed sites may lose appeal. People may move closer to fortified places, hilltops, churches, monasteries, river crossings, or defensible clusters. In some regions, larger Roman-style estates give way to smaller or differently organized rural units. In others, continuity persists beneath changed ownership and changed language. The same field may be worked by descendants of families who barely appear in written sources, even as rulers above them change names, titles, and allegiances. Survival often depends less on dramatic migration than on local recalibration. A shorter road to refuge, a better spring, a stronger landlord, a safer valley, a church with grain stores. Patronage becomes more important when states cannot guarantee protection. A free smallholder under pressure may seek the shelter of a powerful landowner. A hungry family may attach itself to an estate monastery or military household. Such arrangements can preserve life while reducing independence. This is one of the darker forms of adaptation. Survival may come at the cost of freedom, mobility, or future bargaining power. In a weakened world, protection is rarely given without expectation. The social order hardens in some places because hardship drives people toward those who control land, food, and force. Religious communities often become anchors. Monasteries in particular can function as storehouses, farms, places of prayer centers, of copying shelters for travelers, and nodes of local authority. Their role varies enormously by region and period, but in a time of instability they can offer continuity where civic institutions weaken. A monastery with land discipline, labor, and networks of donation may survive when a town council fades. A church may become the place where famine is interpreted, relief is organized, and memory is preserved. This does not make religious institutions immune to crisis. They too suffer shortage and disease. But they can gather people around a story of endurance, and stories matter when the world appears to have lost its pattern. Pastoral communities adapt differently. Herders live with movement as part of their ordinary world, but climate stress can make movement more urgent and more contested. Poor pasture in one area may push animals and people toward another, creating friction with settled farmers, rival groups, or political authorities. Herd loss can be catastrophic because animals are wealth, food transport status, and future recovery all at once. Yet mobility can also be an advantage. A farming village tied to one valley may suffer a failed crop with few options, while herders may seek better grazing if routes remain open. The same crisis that weakens one way of life may shift power toward another, though not without danger. Trade does not disappear, but it may become more selective and local. Long-distance luxury exchange can survive under elite demand, while everyday trade contracts around safer routes. Salt-iron grain animals, textiles, and tools remain necessary. People continue to bargain because no village produces everything it needs. But insecurity raises the cost of distance. A world of shorter journeys is not necessarily a world without commerce. It is a world where distance has become heavier. This change shapes memory as much as economy. Places once connected by routine begin to feel remote. Local horizons thicken. Resilience also appears in law, custom, and informal practice. Communities develop ways to share, water-manage common pasture, regulate harvest labor, protect storage care for widows and orphans, and respond to theft or hoarding. Some of these practices are old. Crisis makes them sharper. Others emerge because conditions demand new compromises. Written law may remain grand and imperial, but survival often depends on local arrangements too small to enter official records. The evidence remains incomplete because practical cooperation leaves faint traces unless it fails spectacularly. Yet without such cooperation, many communities would not have endured at all. There is no innocence in this survival. Scarcity can produce generosity, but it can also produce exclusion. Outsiders may be refused. The poor may be blamed. Migrants may be feared. Accusations of sin, impurity, hoarding, betrayal, or divine punishment may attach themselves to vulnerable people. Families may make choices that later moral language would struggle to judge fairly. A hungry world is not automatically noble. It is pressured, frightened, inventive, sometimes compassionate, sometimes cruel. This complexity is what makes the lost era human rather than merely tragic. By the time the worst of the dimming passes, the people who remain do not return to exactly the same world. Fields may be fewer diets, altered settlements shifted, authorities changed, roads less trusted, and memories marked by fear. Children born after the first darkened summers grow up in households shaped by stories of scarcity. They inherit habits formed in crisis caution, with grain suspicion of distant promises, reliance on kin, reverence for local protectors, and perhaps a deeper sense that the sky itself can betray expectation. Survival becomes legacy before anyone names it as such. So beneath the pale and recovering light, the changed landscape fills not only with ruins but with adjustments. Smoke rises from smaller settlements. Animals graze where fields once reached farther. Churches stand at the centre of communities that once looked towards civic halls. Paths bend towards safer places. People plant, harvest, mourn, marry, rebuild, and remember. The Lost Era is not only a story of what was broken, it is also the story of how human beings with incomplete knowledge and limited choices learned to live after the sky had shown them that even the sun was not guaranteed. A new order is rarely born in a single moment. It forms the way a shoreline changes after repeated storms, not by vanishing all at once, but by losing one edge, gaining another, and slowly becoming a shape that would have startled those who remembered the old coast. After the sky turns dark after the cold years, hunger plague war and weakened roads, the late antique world does not simply end. It rearranges. Some institutions survive under older names. Some collapse quietly. Some are absorbed into new systems. Some become more powerful precisely because everything around them is less certain. The world that emerges is not empty of the past. It is crowded with fragments of it reused and reinterpreted by people who have more urgent concerns than preserving the old design. The phrase often used for this transformation is the passage from late antiquity into the early medieval world, but that phrase can make the change sound cleaner than it was. No one wakes one morning and discovers that antiquity has ended. Roman law still matters. Imperial titles still carry prestige. Cities still stand. Coins still circulate in some places. Latin, Greek, Syriac, Persian, Coptic, Gothic, and many other languages continue to carry memory and power. Farmers keep working fields whose boundaries may be older than the rulers who claim them. Churches preserve texts from a past they are also helping to transform. Continuity is everywhere, but it is continuity under pressure. The crisis after the darkened sky may have helped accelerate this transformation, though scholars still debate how much weight it deserves. It did not create every change. The Western Roman Empire had already fragmented. Long-distance trade had already shifted in many regions. Military pressures already existed. Religious institutions were already growing in influence. Ruralization had already begun in some places. But environmental shock can act like a tightening band around existing weaknesses. It reduces surplus strains, taxation, weakens cities, unsettles borders, and makes local protection more important. It does not write history alone, but it changes the conditions under which people make choices. One of the clearest shifts is the growing importance of local power. When roads are less safe and distant, authorities less reliable, people turn toward nearer forms of protection. A village may care less about imperial ideology than about the Lord Bishop monastery fortress or armed household that can offer food mediation and defense. This does not mean central states disappear everywhere. The Eastern Roman Empire survives and adapts. Persian power remains formidable for a time. In China, state formation moves in a different direction toward reunification under new dynastic structures. But across many regions, the experience of insecurity strengthens the practical value of local authority. Power becomes more immediate, more personal, and often more tied to land. Land becomes the center of survival in a sharper way. Wealth measured in urban offices, long-distance commerce, or civic display does not vanish, but landholding offers food, labor, and protection in an uncertain age. Large estates, church lands, monastic holdings, military grants, and aristocratic domains become crucial units of power. People who control land can control access to grain pasture, woodland mills, and shelter. Those who lack land may seek dependence in exchange for survival. Such dependence takes many forms, and it would be misleading to project later medieval systems too neatly backward onto every 6th century region. Still, the direction is visible in many places. The social world bends toward landed protection and obligation. The Church also becomes a central institution in the new order, especially in former Western Roman territories. Its rise is not caused by the darkened sky, but crisis makes its functions more visible. Bishops can act as negotiators, judges, patrons, relief, organizers, guardians of civic memory, and representatives of communities before kings or generals. Monasteries can preserve learning, cultivate land shelter travelers, and shape landscapes through discipline and labor. Churches hold rituals for famine, plague, death, harvest, and fear. In a world where old civic institutions weaken, religious institutions often provide continuity. They keep records, own property, gather people, and offer a language in which suffering can be understood. This religious language matters because the new order is not merely political, it is mental and emotional. People living through disaster do not only need walls and grain, they need explanations. The darkened sun, the failed crops, and the plague all press against ideas of divine justice, cosmic balance, sin, punishment, mercy, and renewal. Communities may interpret survival as grace, suffering as warning, and endurance as proof of faith. These interpretations can comfort discipline and control. They can inspire charity, but they can also harden boundaries against those judged impure, foreign, sinful, or dangerous. The spiritual order that grows stronger in crisis is therefore both refuge and authority. In the Eastern Roman world, the old imperial order does not disappear, but it changes under accumulated strain. Justinian's reconquests briefly restore imperial rule over parts of the Western Mediterranean, but the cost is immense. Italy is devastated by war. North Africa remains valuable but vulnerable. The Balkans face continuing pressure. The empire's resources are stretched across territories that are difficult to hold. Plague and climate stress do not single-handedly break imperial ambition, but they deepen the burden. Over time, the empire becomes less like the broad, classical Mediterranean power it remembers, and more like a hardened, adaptive state centered on survival, defense, taxation, faith, and a shrinking but resilient core. Persia's story also moves toward transformation, though not immediately because of the darkened sky alone. The Sasanian Empire remains a great power for generations, yet it too faces the cumulative effects of war, internal strain, elite conflict, and environmental pressure. The long Roman-Persian rivalry eventually exhausts both empires in the early 7th century, just before the rapid rise of Arab Muslim power transforms the Near East and Mediterranean world. It would be wrong to draw a straight line from volcanic haze to conquest. History is not a row of falling stones that all begin with one push. But the 6th century crisis helps reveal how even great imperial systems can carry wounds forward, making later shocks more dangerous. A lesser-known feature of this transition is how memory of administration survives even where administration weakens. Documents may become rarer, tax systems may simplify or fragment, urban offices may fade, yet people remember categories of law, land, rank, and obligation. New rulers often borrow the prestige of the old. Barbarian kings use Roman titles. Bishops preserve Roman civic roles. Local elites present themselves as heirs to older order, even when their world functions differently. The New Age is not built from pure invention, it is built from salvage. Broken imperial pieces become tools in hands that use them for new purposes. Material culture shows the same pattern. Stones from Roman buildings are reused in churches, walls, houses, and fortifications. Roads remain useful even when maintenance declines. Coins may continue to circulate long after the authority behind them has weakened. Latin inscriptions, legal formulas, imperial images, and Christian symbols overlap in landscapes where identity is changing gradually. A person living among these remains might not think of them as ruins in the modern sense. They are available material sacred memory, useful shelter, prestigious fragments, or simply part of the visible world. The past is not gone, it is underfoot. The new order is also shaped by demographic shock. Plague and hunger may reduce populations in some regions, though exact numbers remain debated. Lower population can mean abandoned land labour shortages, altered settlement, and changes in the balance between elites and workers. In some places, survivors may gain access to land or resources. In others, dependence deepens because powerful people consolidate holdings. There is no single social result. Catastrophe does not automatically liberate or enslave. It rearranges bargaining power unevenly according to local institutions, violence, ecology, and chance. What makes this era so important is that the old Mediterranean-centered world becomes less universally dominant in imagination and practice. The center of gravity shifts. Northern and inland regions develop new political importance. Local kingdoms become more durable. Religious networks replace some civic networks. Rural power rises relative to urban public life. The ancient city does not vanish, but it no longer defines civilization in quite the same way across the West. Roads still matter, but fewer roads matter to everyone. Authority becomes more regional. Time itself begins to feel different, less tied to the confident continuity of Rome, and more to sacred history, dynastic memory, local survival, and inherited fracture. Still, the new order should not be imagined only as decline. That would miss its creativity. People build new institutions because they need them. They create new legal blends, new artistic forms, new settlement patterns, new religious landscapes, new alliances, and new ways of imagining community. Loss is real, but so is adaptation. The early medieval world is not the rubble of antiquity lying motionless. It is a living world growing through the rubble, drawing nourishment from what remains and from what crisis has forced into being. The sky eventually brightens, but the world beneath it has changed. The old systems that seemed permanent before the darkness are no longer trusted in the same way. Cities are smaller in many places. Local powers stand taller. Churches and monasteries hold more of the social center. Empires survive where they can, but survival requires harder choices. Fields are worked by people who have learned that harvest law and heaven are all less predictable than their ancestors believed. The birth of the new order is not announced by trumpets. It appears in quieter forms: a fortified hilltop, a bishop's storehouse, a reused column, a tenant seeking protection, a road travelled less often, a child growing up among ruins that are no longer ruins to him, but simply the world. Legends of a darkened sky do not preserve the past the way ice preserves sulfate, or trees preserve narrow rings. They do something more unstable and more human. They carry fear through imagination. They turn failed harvests, strange light plague carts, empty roads, and winter hunger into symbols that can survive long after the original witnesses are gone. A community may forget the exact year. It may forget the name of the ruler, the place of the eruption, the number of the dead, or the sequence of bad seasons. But it may remember that there was once a time when the world seemed to grow cold, when the sun weakened, when death moved widely, and when ordinary order appeared to crack. The 6th century darkness enters written memory through chronicles, religious histories, annals, and later compilations. These records are not neutral windows. They are shaped by belief politics genre and the expectations of readers. A dim sun may become a sign of divine anger. Famine may become punishment for sin. Plague may become a test of repentance. War may become the visible consequence of moral disorder. In such writings, the sky is rarely only weather. It is a message. The heavens and human society are imagined as connected, and when the heavens appear wounded, people search for wounds in the moral world below. This does not make the accounts worthless. On the contrary, their interpretations are part of the historical evidence. They show how disaster was experienced. Modern climate science can explain how volcanic aerosols scatter sunlight, but it cannot replace the emotional shock of living beneath a sun that seems changed. For an ancient observer, a pale sun is not merely a reduction in incoming solar radiation. It is a sign that the boundary between normal life and cosmic disorder has thinned. The world has become readable in a terrifying way, and the reader does not know whether the text is warning judgment or doom. In Christian lands, the darkened sky and plague fit naturally into a language of trial punishment and repentance. Processions, prayers, fasting, almsgiving, and appeals to saints may intensify in times of crisis. The suffering body becomes linked to the suffering community. A failed harvest is not only an agricultural problem, it is an invitation to examine sin, authority, charity, and obedience. This can produce compassion as communities organize relief and care for the dying. It can also produce fear and accusation because disaster often seeks a target when its real causes are invisible. The evidence remains incomplete, but the social power of interpretation is clear. A society's explanation of disaster helps shape who receives help, who receives blame, and who claims authority. Beyond Christian settings, other traditions also link cosmic disorder with earthly disorder. In many ancient and late antique cultures, unusual celestial or atmospheric events are understood as omens. A dim sun, comet, eclipse, red sky, failed rain, or unseasonable frost can enter political thought as a sign that rulers are failing. Rituals have been neglected, ancestors are displeased, or heaven's mandate has weakened. These systems of meaning differ greatly from one region to another, but they share a deep assumption: nature and society are not separate worlds. The sky is part of history. Later memory may preserve the emotional shape of the 6th century catastrophe, even when direct lines of transmission are uncertain. In northern traditions, stories of terrible winters, failing sunlight, and a world approaching destruction have invited comparison with real climate crises. The most famous example is the later Norse vision of a great winter before cosmic ruin and renewal. Some scholars have cautiously suggested that memories of 6th century cooling could have contributed to such imagery, especially if communities in Scandinavia suffered severe hardship during that period. Yet caution is necessary. These texts were written down much later, shaped by mythology, poetry, Christian-era transmission, and symbolic structure. They cannot be treated as eyewitness reports of the year the sky turned dark. Still, their power may reflect a cultural memory of cold hunger and fragility that reaches deeper than any single manuscript. This is one of the strange features of catastrophe. It may survive not as data but as mood. A society may remember the feeling of a world out of balance better than it remembers the cause. The darkened sun becomes a sign of endings. The failed harvest becomes a tale of divine warning. The plague becomes proof that human pride is brittle. The deserted road becomes a symbol of abandonment. Over generations, the original event may dissolve into moral story, mythic image, or inherited dread. What began as sulfur in the atmosphere becomes a memory of cosmic winter. The legends also reveal something about scale. People in the 6th century could not know they were living through a hemispheric climate anomaly. Their world was local, regional, imperial, sacred, and practical. They knew what happened in their own fields, ports, courts, and churches. They heard reports from travellers and officials. They may have believed disaster was widespread, but they could not map it through tree rings and polar ice. Later science gives the event planetary scale. Ancient memory gives it human depth. Neither is complete without the other. The archive of nature shows that the sky truly changed. The archive of story shows what that change meant to people who could not explain it. There is also silence in the legends, and silence can be as revealing as speech. Many communities left no written account at all. Their darkness, if they experienced it, vanished with them. Oral memories may have faded, merged, or been absorbed into other stories. Some suffering was too ordinary to be recorded by elites. Some places endured the crisis without producing texts that survived. The result is a record tilted toward literate centers, religious institutions, and later transmitters. The lost era is partly lost because the people most exposed to hunger and disease were often least able to preserve their own interpretation of events. Even so, echoes remain. A chronicler's note about a dim sun, a sermon shaped by plague, a later myth of terrible cold, a saint's life describing famine relief, a legal text responding to abandoned land or disrupted inheritance, a burial practice altered under pressure. These fragments do not form a single legend, but together they show a world trying to place disaster into memory. They show people refusing to let suffering remain meaningless, even when meaning is uncertain. That refusal is one of humanity's oldest habits. Under the darkened sky, history becomes more than what happens. It becomes what people believe has happened, what they fear will happen next, and what they tell their descendants. The volcano may be hidden, the aerosols may vanish, the cold years may pass, but the memory of a weakened sun can linger in chronicles, rituals, warnings, and stories of a world nearly unmade. And in those stories, the lost era survives not as a clean record, but as a shadow with a human voice. The era that rewrote history does not stand in the record like a single ruined city waiting to be excavated. It is scattered across the planet in traces that only become meaningful when placed beside one another, a narrow ring in a tree that once struggled through a cold summer, a sulfate spike frozen into polar ice, a chronicler's troubled description of a weakened sun, a cemetery holding the genetic trace of plague, a settlement that shrinks a trade pattern, that thins a road that remains on the map but no longer carries the same world. No one clue is enough. Together they suggest an age when the natural world pressed hard against human systems, already full of strain. The old temptation is to turn this into a simple story. A volcano erupts, the sky darkens, crops fail, plague arrives, empires weaken, antiquity ends and the medieval world begins. It is dramatic, memorable, and too clean. The real past is less obedient. The 6th century crisis does not explain every war, every migration, every abandoned town, every weakened state, or every cultural transformation. The Western Roman Empire had already fallen as a political structure before the sun dimmed. The Eastern Roman Empire survived for centuries afterward. Persia remained powerful before later exhausting itself in war. China followed its own complicated path of division and reunification. Local communities endured, adapted, and sometimes prospered in the middle of wider disruption. No single explanation fully accounts for this age. Yet rejecting simplicity does not mean rejecting significance. The darkened sky matters because it altered conditions at a critical moment. It reduced warmth when agrarian societies depended on seasonal reliability. It sharpened hunger when states needed revenue and armies needed food. It weakened bodies before disease moved through connected routes. It placed extra weight on cities, borders, roads, markets, and beliefs. Climate did not command history like an emperor issuing orders. It acted more like pressure in the foundations of a building already cracked. Some walls held, some shifted, some collapsed much later because the damage had been carried forward. That's why the lost era after the sky turned dark feels so haunting. It reveals how the visible strength of civilization can hide dependence on invisible balances. A capital may glitter with marble and gold, but it still depends on rain, sunlight, soil, ships, animals, and labor. A border may be defended by forts, but forts require grain from fields behind them. A law code may declare order, but order becomes fragile when people are hungry and frightened. A religion may give suffering meaning, but meaning does not prevent grief. The ancient world was not foolish for assuming the sun would return with its usual strength. Every civilization makes some version of that assumption. It builds its plans on patterns that seem permanent until they fail. The legacy of the crisis is therefore not a single collapse but a changed direction. In many regions, urban life becomes smaller or differently organized. Local power grows in importance. Churches and monasteries become more central as institutions of memory, relief, authority, and land holding. Trade routes contract shift or become more selective. Political legitimacy becomes more tightly tied to the ability to provide protection in a frightening world. The old Mediterranean order does not vanish everywhere at once, but it loses some of its reach and confidence. The world after the darkness is more regional, more fortified, more rural in many places, and more dependent on institutions that can survive close to the ground. The mystery remains because the cause is still partly hidden. The evidence points strongly toward major volcanic eruptions, perhaps more than one, sending sulfur high into the atmosphere and cooling the northern hemisphere. But the exact volcano, the full sequence, and the precise regional effects are still debated. The source may have been remote, its local victims may have left no writing, its ash may have fallen where later water ice vegetation or time obscured it. The event that changed distant harvests may have begun in a place almost absent from the surviving historical record. That absence gives the era its strange shape, a disaster known by its consequences more than by its origin. What survives in the record suggests that people experienced this not as an abstract climate anomaly, but as a collapse of expectation. The sun was supposed to warm, fields were supposed to ripen, roads were supposed to connect, rulers were supposed to protect, the dead were supposed to be buried according to custom, seasons were supposed to return with recognizable mercy. When those expectations failed, people did what human beings have always done. They stored, prayed, fled, fought, interpreted, blamed, adapted, mourned, rebuilt, and remembered. Some left texts, most left only traces. Many left nothing that can be named. The lost era after the sky turned dark rewrote history because it exposed the relationship between catastrophe and transformation. It shows that great changes are rarely born from one cause. They emerge when environment, disease, politics, war, economy, belief, and human choice converge. A volcanic eruption alone does not create a new age, but a volcanic eruption falling upon a strained world can make old answers fail sooner, force new arrangements faster, and leave memories deep enough to echo through centuries. The sky brightens again, but not over the same world that first watched it fade. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part of the story. The disaster passes, yet its consequences remain folded into the future. A child born after the cold years may never see the dim sun that frightened his grandparents, but he may live in a smaller town under a stronger local lord near a church that has become the centre of public life on land, reorganized by death and hunger, along a road used less often than before. He may inherit the aftermath without knowing the cause. History often works this way. The world changes and later generations call the changed world normal. The darkened sky becomes a reminder that eras can turn without anyone understanding the mechanism. The ancient witnesses saw a pale sun and searched for meaning. Modern scholars see ice chemistry, tree rings plague genomes, settlement shifts and climate models, and still the full story remains incomplete. Between those two kinds of knowledge lies the human past itself, fragile, adaptive, wounded, and persistent. The sky turned dark, but people continued beneath it. In their survival losses, fears, and transformations, an old world began to loosen, and another slowly took shape in the shadow it left behind. The story ends not with the volcano, and not with the plague, and not with a single fallen empire. It ends with a quieter image, a landscape after the worst has passed, still marked by what happened, but no longer speaking of it loudly. The light has returned with more strength. Grass grows again over abandoned edges of fields. Smoke rises from settlements that have survived by becoming smaller, harder, and more careful. Roads still cross the land, though some are travelled less often. Walls still stand around cities, though the life inside them has changed. In the countryside, people bend over the soil as their ancestors did, trusting the seasons again because life gives them little choice. The dark years recede into memory. Children hear of them as a time when the sun weakened, when harvests failed, when sickness moved through towns, when families counted grain and graves with the same frightened attention. Some memories become prayers, some become warnings, some become legends of winter judgment or a world out of balance. Others disappear entirely, carried by people whose names were never written down. The sky leaves no monument. The air clears. The aerosols fall. The eruption's veil dissolves. Yet history keeps the shape of that veil long after it can no longer be seen. Across centuries, stone is reused, roads fade into grass, churches rise inside old cities, and new powers inherit the ground of older ones. The people who live after the catastrophe do not think of themselves as living in an aftermath forever. They marry, plant, bargain, worship, travel, build, and bury their dead. They make ordinary life from extraordinary inheritance. That is one of the quiet truths of history. Every age lives among the consequences of events it only partly understands. The lost era after the sky turned dark remains powerful because it brings the vast and the intimate together. A mountain breaks open somewhere beyond the horizon, and a family far away eats less bread. Sulphur enters the high air, and a ruler struggles to feed an army. A tree narrows its ring, and a village remembers a summer that never truly warmed. The world is immense, but its forces reach into the smallest rooms, and in the final distance the image becomes still a pale sun lifting over cold fields, then slowly brightening across years of survival. Beneath it, the old world is not restored exactly as it was. Nothing ever is. But life continues, carrying the shadow forward, softened by time, hidden in memory and written quietly into the land.